Hey, good afternoon, everybody. Mike Shea, your Florida business broker. Just getting back from Denver. I was out there for the IBBA and the Trans World Conference. It was a great conference. Took a couple classes, and two in particular that I took were specific to working capital in transactions and how it's handled, and WIP. And those two are closely related. And I picked those two to talk about because very often the Main Street customers that I deal with, small businesses in $5 million in revenue and under, where you have WIP, which is work in progress, or you have working capital, oftentimes that becomes a point of contention in the transaction. And the reason is that they're handled differently. They're handled differently at Main Street than they're handled at private equity. And I'm going to break it down in the simplest of terms so everybody can understand it, because we're not all accountants. I'm not, and let me just kind of make it simple for you. At Main Street, working capital is not included in a transaction. So we draw a line in the sand and the buyer has to have their own working capital. It usually does not become an issue because the dollar sizes are relatively small, and the buyer and seller either work out if working capital is going to be included, or the buyer will just have enough to float the operation, or will borrow from an SBA loan and get the working capital. Same thing with WIP, work in progress. We generally don't see small manufacturing companies, but we'll see it in landscaping companies where a job will be in progress and we'll have to kind of draw a line in the sand and figure out who's done what work up to where, and again, figure out the proration of who's owed what, or we'll just, the seller will be gracious and give it forward, or the buyer will just take it as a concession and let the seller work through it and finish the job. Or sometimes we can just time it so that doesn't become a factor. Now, when we get to middle market and private equity type deals, the expectation on the part of the buyer and the customary norm historically has been that working capital is an asset and it sits on the balance sheet, because assets minus liabilities equals working capital. And they will do a calculation and try and figure out. You should make sure, if you're a larger business, anywhere between $900 to $900,000 in cash flow and up, or $700,000 in cash flow. Sometimes we see smaller deals go into the middle market from a strategic perspective, that you are including working capital and know that that's probably going to be asked for by the buyer. Now, super important that you figure out the calculation. Super important that you recognize that's going to be a component for it, the buyer to get. Now, why is it important? Because most times small business owners don't prepare their balance sheets properly and don't operate their books really well, and delineating working capital appropriately can be an issue. Just recently, I had a guy who was running a third business through his business, and there were some incremental assets, and it was a trucking company inside of a landscaping company, and the trucking company was hauling citrus for farms and was getting paid 90 days, while the lawn care company was getting paid net 30. And what happened is it made the working capital calculation look really crazy, and we had to argue through it. So it is super important that as a business owner, when you're thinking of going to market, that you make sure you understand this and that your broker understands it, and that you start preparing an estimate of working capital at the beginning of your listing. If it's seasonal, we need to know that, but it is a thing that can cause a great deal of problems and can cause deals to fall apart. So working capital is important, WIP's important, they go hand in hand. If you're a middle market or a private equity type deal, which means, generally speaking, $750,000 in cash flow and up, you are possibly going to be a target. So you need to understand these two components of your deal structure. Any questions, give me a call, 321-287-0349, or email me at mike@tworld.com. Thanks.